Have you ever felt the weight of a promise whispered in the silence? A vow from a God unseen? Its echo lingering through the ages like a sacred breath, challenging your trust in the unseen, stirring your soul with questions you dare not voice, awakening a longing you cannot name, a yearning that pierces the night, a cry that echoes in the void, a whisper that haunts your dreams. What if the storms that shatter your world, the floods that threaten to drown your hope, the chaos that unravels your peace, the trials that test your faith, the shadows that haunt your days, the burdens that weigh your spirit, are not punishment but a canvas for a covenant painted in the sky, a sign of faithfulness you have overlooked in your despair, a light hidden in the darkness of your struggles, a promise veiled in the tempest, a hope buried in the ruin. Could the barrenness of your soul, the wilderness of your waiting, the emptiness that echoes in your nights, the silence that haunts your days, the desolation that weighs on your heart, the loneliness that grips your mind, hold a seed of divine promise, a seed that blooms only when you surrender to the one who never fails, who turns ashes into beauty, who breathes life into dust, who mends what is broken, who restores what is lost, who redeems what is forsaken. Why does the Creator, who commands the winds to roar and calms the seas with a word, who holds the stars in his hands and numbers the sands of the shore, who paints the dawn with his glory and carves the mountains with his will, who shapes the rivers with his breath and lights the heavens with his fire, bind himself with oaths to frail humanity, weaving his faithfulness into the fabric of time itself, a thread unbroken by human frailty, a love that defies our doubt, a grace that outlasts our failures, a mercy that transcends our sin, a promise that outshines our darkness. And what if this silent promise, this unbroken thread of divine loyalty, is not just a relic of history, but a living call, urging you to trust him as the floods rise, the deserts stretch, and the mountains tremble, to find hope in his unchanging love amidst the storm, to anchor your soul in his eternal vow, to rest in his presence when all else fades, to seek his light when the night deepens, to embrace his grace when the weight grows heavy. These questions rise like mist from the depths of the soul, drawing us into the sacred mystery where God's faithfulness meets human frailty, where his voice speaks through silence, where his promises endure beyond the chaos of time, where his love pierces the darkness of doubt, where his presence calms the tempest of fear, where his grace shines through the shadow of despair, where his truth stands firm amid the ruin, where his mercy flows through the wreckage. They summon us to a place of awe, where the earth bears witness to his covenants, where the heavens declare his truth, where the heart learns to trust the one whose word never returns void, whose love never wavers, whose promise never fades, whose presence never abandons, whose grace never fails, whose mercy never ends, whose faithfulness never breaks, whose light never dims. In a world where promises crumble like dust beneath the feet of time, where human vows fade with the wind's whisper, where trust is shattered by the sting of betrayal, where hope is drowned by the waves of despair, where faith is tested by the fires of trial, where love is broken by the weight of sin, where peace is lost to the clamor of chaos, where strength falters under the burden of doubt, where joy is eclipsed by the shadow of loss. God's faithfulness stands as an unshakable rock, a silent promise woven through the ages, calling us to hope, to believe, to rest in his unchanging heart, to find strength in his eternal love, to seek refuge in his boundless grace, to anchor our souls in his unfailing word, to discover peace in his everlasting presence. Picture a world submerged in floodwaters, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the bitter tang of salt, the sky a canvas of gray pierced by streaks of lightning, a storm that swallows hope, a deluge that drowns the cries of a fallen world, a torrent that washes away sin yet spares a remnant, a flood that reshapes the earth, a deluge that echoes with divine purpose, a rain that cleanses with mercy. The waves crash against the ark, their roar a symphony of chaos, mingling with the distant cries of a creation undone, a world washed clean yet trembling under divine judgment, a testament to sin's weight, a mirror of human rebellion, a canvas for divine mercy, a stage for a promise to unfold, a theater of grace amid ruin, a chorus of redemption in the tempest. The wood creaks beneath your feet, wet and cold, grounding you in the moment. Yet your heart pounds with the weight of survival, the uncertainty of what lies beyond the deluge, the fear of a future unseen, the hope of a promise untested, the burden of faith in the unseen, the ache of trust in the unknown, the tremor of hope in the storm, the whisper of faith in the flood. A sudden hush falls, the rain softens, and a faint arc of color breaks through the clouds, a rainbow, its hues shimmering like a whispered vow, a promise etched in light against the darkness, a sign of mercy amid judgment, a beacon of hope in despair, a pledge of life beyond the flood, a covenant written in the sky, a bridge between heaven and earth, a sign of peace in the silence. The air tastes of renewal, a mingling of water and hope, a blend of cleansing and grace, a fusion of judgment and compassion, a harmony of wrath and love, a symphony of restoration and hope, a melody of redemption and peace, a reminder that even in destruction, God's faithfulness stands firm, a silent covenant carved into the heavens, a pledge that endures when all else fails, a love that outlasts the storm, a hope that rises from the flood, a peace that calms the chaos, a light that pierces the night, a grace that lifts the soul. What is it like to stand in such a vessel, where every creek is a test of faith, where the rainbow becomes your anchor, where trust in God's promise is your only light, where the storm's end reveals his unchanging love, where the silence speaks of his mercy, where the waters part to show his grace, where the dove's return ignites your hope, where the earth's renewal whispers his name, where the promise holds your heart, where the covenant steadies your soul, where the flood becomes a cradle of faith, where the rainbow paints your future. What stirs within you when you hear this call? Do you trust the promises of a God you cannot see? Or do you cling to the wreckage of your own understanding, doubting his faithfulness in the flood, fearing his silence, rejecting his mercy, turning from his light, grasping at the ruins of your own strength, seeking refuge in your own wisdom, fleeing the shelter of his love? I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Genesis chapter 9:13. God's faithfulness is not a fleeting word, but a binding oath, a silent promise that endures through every storm, every trial, every tear, a vow that speaks louder than the thunder, a love that outlasts the rain, a covenant that holds when all else breaks, a grace that shines when all else fades, a mercy that flows when all else dries, a presence that comforts when all else crumbles. Will you anchor your soul in his covenant? Or will you drift, swayed by the waves of doubt, lost in the shadows of fear, adrift in the chaos of your own making, blind to the rainbow of his grace, deaf to the whisper of his hope, unable to see the light of his promise, unwilling to feel the warmth of his embrace? In a world where promises crumble like dust beneath the feet of time, where human vows fade with the wind's whisper, where trust is shattered by the sting of betrayal, where hope is drowned by the waves of despair, where faith is tested by the fires of trial, where love is broken by the weight of sin, where peace is lost to the clamor of chaos, where strength falters under the burden of doubt, where joy is eclipsed by the shadow of loss, where courage wanes under the weight of fear. God's faithfulness stands as an unshakable rock, a silent promise woven through the ages, calling us to hope, to believe, to rest in his unchanging heart, to find strength in his eternal love, to seek refuge in his boundless grace, to anchor our souls in his unfailing word, to discover peace in his everlasting presence, to find light in his infinite mercy. From the floodwaters of Noah to the deserts of Abraham, from the thunder of Sinai to the fields of a coming king, his covenant echoes, a thread of divine loyalty that binds heaven to earth, a whisper of grace that speaks through silence, a light that pierces the darkness of human frailty, a strength that upholds when all else falls, a presence that comforts when all else fails, a love that endures when all else fades, a promise that shines when all else dims, a hope that rises when all else sinks. This is not a tale of the past, but a living truth, a call to see his faithfulness in every season, to hear his promise in every trial, to rest in his unchanging love amidst the chaos of life, to find his presence in the silence of waiting, to trust his hand in the shadow of doubt, to anchor your soul in the rock of his word, to seek his light in the depth of your night, to embrace his grace in the weight of your burdens, to discover his peace in the storm of your soul. Chapter: The Covenant with Noah, a promise in the flood. The first whisper of God's faithfulness came in the wake of destruction, when the earth groaned under the weight of sin, and the flood waters rose in to cleanse the world, to wash away corruption, to restore what was broken, to make way for a new beginning, to pave the path for redemption, to open the door to grace, to lay the foundation for hope. Noah, a man of righteousness in a world of corruption, built an ark at God's command, a vessel of hope amidst a sea of despair, a testament to trust in an unseen promise, a beacon of faith in a drowning age, a refuge for life amid death, a symbol of grace amid judgment, a light in the deluge of darkness, a sanctuary in the tempest of wrath. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Genesis 6:18. This was no mere survival. It was the birth of a covenant, a pledge that God would never again destroy the earth with flood. A sign sealed in the rainbow, a silent promise etched in the sky, a vow that spoke of mercy amid judgment, of life beyond death, of hope beyond despair, of love beyond wrath, of grace beyond ruin, of peace beyond chaos. Picture the ark swaying on turbulent waters, the air heavy with the scent of wet timber and the sharp tang of salt, the sound of rain pounding like a relentless drum, a rhythm of judgment and mercy intertwined, a symphony of divine will echoing through the storm, a chorus of creation's renewal, a hymn of redemption, a melody of grace. The interior is dim, lit only by the flicker of oil lamps, their smoky glow casting shadows on the faces of animals, their breaths a chorus of life preserved, a reminder of creation spared, a whisper of hope amid the deluge, a sign of God's care amid chaos, a testament to his providence, a proof of his love, a witness to his mercy. The wood is slick beneath your hands, cold and unyielding, yet it holds you, a fragile refuge built by faith, sustained by a promise you cannot yet see, a structure that groans under the weight of trust, a shelter that defies the storm, a haven that speaks of grace, a fortress of hope in the flood, a sanctuary of mercy in the tempest, a cradle of faith in the deluge. The waters recede, and a hush falls, broken by the soft cooing of a dove returning with an olive leaf, a sign of life, a whisper of hope, a promise fulfilled, a token of renewal in a world reborn, a pledge of life amid the wreckage, a symbol of mercy in the aftermath, a gift of peace in the silence, a beacon of light in the dawn. The air tastes of renewal, a mingling of damp earth and divine grace, a blend of cleansing and compassion, a fusion of judgment and love, a harmony of wrath and redemption, a symphony of restoration and hope, a melody of peace and promise, a reminder that God's faithfulness emerges even from the depths of destruction, a covenant that stands when all else fails, a love that outlasts the storm, a hope that rises from the flood, a peace that calms the chaos, a light that pierces the night, a grace that lifts the soul, a mercy that heals the wound. What is it like to wait in such a vessel, where every creek is a test of faith, where the rainbow becomes your anchor, where trust in God's promise is your only light, where the storm's end reveals his unchanging love, where the silence speaks of his mercy, where the waters part to show his grace, where the dove's return ignites your hope, where the earth's renewal whispers his name, where the promise holds your heart, where the covenant steadies your soul, where the flood becomes a cradle of faith, where the rainbow paints your future, where the peace settles your spirit. Do you trust God's promise in your storms? When floods of trial rise, when hope seems lost, when the waters threaten to overwhelm, when the darkness closes in, when the weight of despair presses down, when the tempest roars around you, when the night deepens your fear, do you cling to his covenant or do you despair? Doubting his faithfulness, fearing his silence, rejecting his mercy, turning from his light, grasping at the ruins of your own strength, seeking refuge in your own wisdom, fleeing the shelter of his love. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it to remember the everlasting covenant. Genesis 9:16. God's promise is not a memory to fade, but a vow to endure, a sign that his love remains steadfast, his mercy everlasting, his faithfulness a rock in the tempest, his grace a shield in the deluge, his presence a light in the storm, his hand a guide in the flood, his heart a refuge in the chaos. Will you look to the rainbow in your darkness, or will you turn away, lost in the flood of your own fears, adrift in the chaos of unbelief, blind to the promise that holds you, deaf to the whisper that saves you, unable to see the grace that lifts you, unwilling to feel the warmth of his embrace, resistant to the peace of his presence? Noah's story teaches us that God's faithfulness is not dependent on our perfection, but on his character. Not on our strength, but on his power. Not on our righteousness, but on his grace. Not on our understanding, but on his wisdom. Not on our merit, but on his mercy. Not on our efforts, but on his love. Not on our faith, but on his faithfulness. The flood washed away sin, yet the rainbow promised life. A covenant that God would sustain his creation. A silent pledge that echoes through time. A call to trust him when the waters rise. To believe his promise when the world crumbles. To rest in his grace when all seems lost. To find hope when despair threatens. To seek his light when the night is long. To anchor your soul in his unchanging vow. To discover his peace when the storm rages. But the flood was not without its shadows. Consider Lot. Spared by God's mercy, yet tested by the destruction around him. Genesis 19:16. As the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah burned, Lot hesitated, his heart torn between the life he knew and the salvation offered, his soul caught between the past and the promise, his spirit wavering in the smoke, his mind clouded by fear. Yet God's angels pulled him to safety, a sign of faithfulness even in his weakness, a hand of grace amid the flames, a love that rescued amid ruin, a mercy that prevailed amid judgment, a light that shone in the ashes. What does this reveal about God's promise? That it holds even when we falter, that his hand guides when we stumble, that his love rescues when we doubt, that his mercy prevails when we hesitate, that his grace shines when we falter, that his light pierces when we stray, that his peace restores when we break. Are there moments in your life where you've hesitated, where you've doubted his deliverance, where you've clung to what burns rather than what saves, where you've feared to trust his hand, where you've turned from his light in the shadow of your fear, where you've sought refuge in the ashes of your past, where you've resisted the pull of his grace? Consider Hagar, cast out with Ishmael, her hope fading in the desert, Genesis 21:17, her cry rising in the wilderness, her spirit breaking under the sun, her heart heavy with abandonment. Yet God heard her plea, providing water, a sign of faithfulness in exile, a promise fulfilled in desolation, a love that sustained in the dry land, a grace that flowed in the barrenness, a mercy that answered in the silence. What does this teach you about trusting his promise? That it reaches the outcast, that his hand provides in the wilderness, that his love endures in the desert, that his grace flows when all seems dry, that his mercy hears when all seems silent, that his presence comforts when all seems lost. Are there times you've felt cast out, where you've cried in the wilderness, where you've seen his provision when you least expected, where you've felt his love in the silence, where you've found his water in your thirst, where you've tasted his grace in your exile? This is the first thread of his faithfulness, a call to trust him when the storms rage, to see his rainbow in the wreckage, to believe his promise when the world offers no hope, to rest in his covenant when the waters threaten to drown, to find his light when the darkness closes in, to anchor your soul in his unchanging love, to seek his grace when the flood overwhelms, to discover his peace when the waves roar. True are you, the covenant with Abraham, the promise in the wilderness. From the flood came a new beginning, and with Abraham, God wove another strand of his silent promise, a vow spoken in the barrenness of a desert, a pledge of life where death seemed certain, a hope where despair reigned, a light where shadows loomed, a whisper where silence deafened, a promise where doubt lingered, a covenant where faith trembled. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 17:7. This was no small promise to a childless man and his aging wife, a covenant sealed not in words alone, but in the cutting of flesh, a sign of trust in the unseen, a hope against hope, a faith that defied the odds, a belief that transcended time, a trust that pierced the void, a surrender that opened the heavens, a hope that defied the years. Picture a desert expanse at dusk, the air dry with the scent of sand and distant sage, the horizon ablaze with the fading light of a relentless sun, a vastness that mirrors the emptiness of Abraham's heart, the silence of his longing, the weight of his years, the ache of his dreams, the burden of his weight, the shadow of his doubt. The wind whispers through the dunes, a soft moan that carries the weight of years, the silence of waiting, the ache of a promise unfulfilled, the burden of a dream deferred, the shadow of doubt creeping in, the echo of hope fading, the whisper of faith tested, the murmur of patience strained, the cry of a soul stretched thin. The ground is hot beneath your feet, burning yet grounding, a reminder of the wilderness that tests your faith, that stretches your trust beyond what you can see, that challenges your hope against the barrenness of time, that demands surrender where strength fails, that calls for patience where despair looms, that invites hope where all seems lost, that whispers life where death reigns. A star pierces the night sky, its light a beacon, a whisper of God's vow, a promise of descendants as numerous as the heavens, a hope that stirs your soul, a light that pierces the darkness, a sign of life where death seemed king, a promise that defies the void, a covenant that speaks of future glory, a pledge that lights the night, a star that guides the lost. The air tastes of dust and promise, a mingling of barrenness and blessing, a blend of desolation and hope, a fusion of emptiness and grace, a harmony of silence and redemption, a symphony of longing and fulfillment, a melody of faith and fruition, a sign that God's faithfulness blooms where human hope fades, that his word endures where dreams die, that his love prevails where all else fails, that his grace flows where the desert dries. What is it like to stand in such a desert, where every grain of sand is a test of faith, where the star becomes your hope, where trust in God's promise is your only sustenance, where the silence holds the weight of a vow yet to be fulfilled, where the night stretches your patience, where the dawn holds your destiny, where the vastness mirrors your soul's longing, where the wind carries your prayer, where the stars reflect your faith. Do you trust God's promise in your barrenness, when your life feels empty, when dreams seem dead, when the wilderness stretches before you, when the silence deafens your hope, when the weight of waiting presses down, when the desert burns your faith, when the night deepens your despair? Do you wait on his word, or do you doubt, seeking your own solutions, turning from his vow, chasing shadows instead of stars, grasping at mirages instead of truth, fleeing the light of his promise, rejecting the hope of his grace? He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars. So shall your offspring be." Genesis 15:5. God's faithfulness is a promise that defies human logic, a covenant that turns ashes into beauty, a call to trust when all seems lost, to hope when the night is long, to believe when the future is veiled, to rest when the desert burns, to find light when the darkness thickens, to seek peace when the silence roars, to discover mirrors when the barrenness aches. Will you look to the stars in your wilderness, or will you wander? lost in your own despair, blind to the light of his promise, deaf to the whisper of his love, trapped in the emptiness of your own making, unable to see the dawn of his grace, unwilling to hear the song of his faithfulness, resistant to the touch of his hand. Abraham's journey reveals a God who fulfills his promises in his time, not ours. A God who sees beyond the barrenness, who works beyond the years, who brings life from death, who turns waiting into wonder, who transforms silence into song, who weaves hope from despair, who crafts joy from tears. Years of waiting birthed Isaac, a son of laughter, a living testament to God's faithfulness, a reminder that his word is sure, his covenant unbreakable, his love unshakable, his promise a rock in the desert sand, a light in the night, a hope in the void, a joy in the wilderness, a blessing in the barrenness, a fulfillment in the silence. Yet the journey was not without trial. Consider Sarah, who laughed in disbelief, Genesis 18:12, her faith wavering, her heart doubting, her spirit trembling, her mind questioning. Yet God fulfilled his promise, opening her womb in her old age, Genesis 21:1, a sign of faithfulness beyond human doubt, a miracle born of trust, a gift born of grace, a joy born of patience. What does this teach you about trusting his promise? That it holds even in laughter turned to tears, that his hand works where faith falters, that his love prevails when we question, that his grace shines when we stumble, that his mercy flows when we doubt, that his light guides when we waver. Are there moments in your life where you've laughed at his promises, where you've doubted his timing, where you've feared his silence, yet still felt his hand at work, his breath of life, his touch of hope, his light of redemption, his peace of assurance? Consider Isaac, offered as a sacrifice, Genesis 22:2, his life a test of Abraham's faith. Yet God provided a ram, a sign of faithfulness and obedience, a promise fulfilled in surrender, a love that spared in trial, a grace that rewarded in trust. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it strengthens in sacrifice, that his faithfulness provides in testing, that his love upholds in obedience, that his grace shines in devotion. Are there times you've faced sacrifice, where you've trusted his provision, where you've seen his hand in the offering, where you've felt his love in the altar? Consider Rebekah, chosen as Isaac's bride through a prayerful test, Genesis 24:27. Her obedience a sign of God's faithfulness, her journey a testament to his guidance, her life a thread in the covenant's unfolding. A light in the search, a hope in the union. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it guides even in the unknown, that his hand directs when we seek, that his love leads when we follow, that his grace lights the path. Are there paths in your life where you've sought his guidance, where you've trusted his leading, where you've seen his faithfulness in the steps you take, where you've felt his love in the journey? This is the second thread, a call to trust his timing, to believe his promise in the desert of delay, to rest in his faithfulness when the world offers no hope, to see his stars when the night is darkest, to hear his whisper when the silence is loudest, to find his grace when the wilderness stretches wide, to embrace his love when the barrenness weighs heavy, to seek his peace when the desert burns, to discover his joy when the weight endures. Yeah, the covenant with Moses, a promise in the law, from the wilderness came a nation, and with Moses, God's faithfulness took shape in thunder and fire, a covenant etched in stone, a promise sealed with law, a bond between a holy God and a chosen people, a pledge of guidance in the desert of their journey, a light in their darkness, a path in their exile, a hope in their wandering, a strength in their struggle. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Exodus 19:5. This was no mere command, but a pledge of relationship, a call to holiness, a sign that God's faithfulness would guide his people through the wilderness, through the law, through the trials to come, a vow that would shape their identity, their destiny, their hope, their future, their freedom, their faith, their unity. Picture Mount Sinai under a storm-laden sky, the air charged with the scent of ozone and smoldering rock, the ground trembling with the rumble of thunder, a mountain cloaked in smoke and mystery, a throne of divine presence, a place of awe and fear, a sanctuary of divine encounter, a crucible of faith, a summit of revelation, a peak of promise. The wind howls, carrying the echo of a trumpet blast, a sound that pierces the soul, mingling with the distant cries of a people awestruck, fearful, yet drawn to the divine, a nation trembling at the edge of a covenant, a people poised on the brink of promise, a multitude standing in the shadow of grace, a community awaiting a word, a throng seeking a sign, a congregation longing for light. The stones beneath your feet are hot, vibrating with the presence of God, a weight that presses you to your knees, a reminder of His holiness, His power, His promise, a force that demands reverence, a call that invites surrender, a presence that transforms, a voice that commands, a love that draws, a spirit that uplifts. Lightning flashes, illuminating the tablets in Moses' hands, their edges glowing with the law, a covenant carved by divine fire, a promise written in stone, a testament to God's faithfulness, a guide for His people, a light in their darkness, a path through their wilderness, a beacon in their night, a foundation for their future, a rock in their storm. The air tastes of sulfur and grace, a mingling of judgment and mercy, a blend of justice and love, a fusion of wrath and redemption, a harmony of holiness and compassion, a symphony of law and liberty, a melody of order and freedom, a sign that God's faithfulness demands obedience, yet offers restoration, a call to trust His law as a path, to see His hand in every command, to find His heart in every decree, to seek His face in every rule, to rest in His peace in every trial. What is it like to stand on such a mountain, where the earth shakes with God's voice, where the law becomes your path, where trust in His covenant is your strength, where the thunder speaks of His power, where the silence holds His promise, where the book reveals His presence, where the fire ignites your faith, where the tablets guide your steps, where the wind carries His word, where the lightning lights your way, where the presence fills your soul. Do you trust God's promise in His commands? When the law feels burdensome, when obedience costs you, when the path seems steep, when the weight of His word presses heavy, when the demands of His will challenge your heart, when the call to holiness tests your soul, when the fire of His law burns your pride, do you see His faithfulness? Or do you rebel, seeking your own way, turning from His guidance, rejecting His wisdom, fleeing His light, grasping at the shadows of your own desires, clinging to the chains of your own will? Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. Leviticus 18:5. God's faithfulness is woven into His law, a promise that obedience brings life, a covenant that leads to His presence, a call to trust His wisdom over your will, to find freedom in His boundaries, to rest in His righteousness, to thrive in His love, to grow in His grace, to stand in His strength, to walk in His peace, to live in His light. Will you follow His path, or will you stray, lost in the wilderness of your own desires, blind to the light of His law, deaf to the voice of His love, trapped in the chains of your own rebellion, unable to see the freedom He offers, unwilling to hear the call He speaks, resistant to the grace He extends? Moses' story unveils a God whose faithfulness provides structure, a law that guides, a covenant that protects, a promise that transforms a nation from slaves to a treasured people, from bondage to freedom, from despair to hope, from darkness to light, from exile to inheritance, from chaos to order, from fear to faith. The thunder of Sinai was not just judgment, but a pledge of love, a silent promise that God would never abandon His own, a call to trust His law as the foundation of their freedom, a guide through the desert, a light in the darkness, a path to His presence, a bridge to His heart, a refuge in their storm, a strength in their weakness. Yet the journey tested this trust. Consider Aaron, who, in Moses' absence, crafted a golden calf, Exodus 32:2-4, yielding to the people's fear, breaking the covenant's demand, succumbing to the pressure of the crowd, bowing to the idol of their making, swayed by the clamor of their doubt. Yet God's faithfulness spared him, offering grace through Moses' intercession. Exodus 32:14, a mercy that tempered justice, a love that restored the broken, a hand that lifted the fallen, a heart that forgave the wayward, a light that redeemed the lost. What does this reveal about God's promise? That it endures even in failure, that his mercy tempers his justice, that his love restores when we falter, that his grace prevails when we stumble, that his hand holds when we fall, that his heart forgives when we stray, that his light shines when we turn, that his peace returns when we repent. Are there times in your life where you've turned to idols, where you've doubted his law, where you've sought comfort over obedience, yet still felt his hand of grace, his breath of mercy, his voice of restoration, his touch of redemption, his presence of peace, his love of renewal? Consider Miriam, who led the people in song after the Red Sea parted, Exodus 15:20-21. Her voice a testament to God's faithfulness, her dance a celebration of his deliverance, her spirit a flame of joy, her heart a well of praise, yet later struck with leprosy for rebellion. Numbers 12:10, only to be healed by his mercy, a sign that his promise holds even in discipline, that his love corrects as it guides, that his grace heals as it chastens, that his covenant endures through correction, that his hand restores through trial. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it withstands our weaknesses, that his faithfulness corrects as it guides, that his love heals as it chastens, that his promise endures through our failures, that his hand restores through our trials, that his mercy prevails in our rebellion, that his grace shines in our repentance. Are there areas where you've rebelled, where you've questioned his ways, where you've felt his discipline, yet still seen his hand of grace at work, his light of hope, his breath of life, his touch of forgiveness, his peace of restoration? Consider Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who offered wise counsel, Exodus 18:19. His guidance a sign of God's faithfulness, his wisdom a support for Moses, his advice a thread in the covenant's unfolding. A reminder that God provides helpers in the journey, a light in the burden, a strength in the task. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it comes through others, that his faithfulness flows through counsel, that his love supports through community, that his grace strengthens through guidance, that his hand uplifts through wisdom. Are there times you've sought wise counsel, where you've felt his hand through others, where you've seen his promise in the support around you, where you've found his love in the voices that guide you, where you've tasted his grace in the help you receive? Consider Caleb, who trusted God's promise to enter Canaan despite the giants' numbers. Numbers 13:30, his faith a sign of God's faithfulness, his courage a testament to his power, his hope a light in the darkness, his voice a challenge to fear, his life a reward of promise fulfilled in his old age, Joshua 14:6-12. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it rewards patience, that his faithfulness honors faith, that his love grants victory to the steadfast, that his grace upholds the faithful, that his promise crowns the persistent, that his light shines on the brave. Are there battles in your life where you've stood firm, where you've trusted his promise, where you've seen his hand prevail, where you've felt his strength sustain, where you've tasted his victory in the struggle, where you've found his peace in the fight? Consider Zipporah, who saved Moses with swift obedience, Exodus 4:25. Her action a sign of God's faithfulness, her courage a thread in the covenant, her love a support in the journey. A reminder that his promise flows through the faithful acts of others. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it works through obedience, that his faithfulness shines in action, that his love sustains through sacrifice, that his grace flows through the willing. Are there moments you've acted in faith, where you've seen his hand in your obedience, where you've felt his love in your sacrifice, where you've found his grace in your courage. Consider Eleazar, who carried the ark with reverence, Numbers 20, 25, 28. His duty, a sign of God's faithfulness. His role, a testament to his promise. His life, a link in the covenant's chain. A reminder that his faithfulness endures through service. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it honors devotion, that his faithfulness rewards duty, that his love upholds service, that his grace strengthens the faithful task. Are there duties in your life where you've served, where you've trusted his promise, where you've seen his hand in your labor, where you've felt his love in your calling? This is the third thread, a reminder to obey his word, to see his faithfulness in every command, to rest in his covenant when the world offers chaos, to trust his law as a light, to find his presence in the thunder, to hear his promise in the silence, to seek his grace in the discipline, to embrace his love in the correction, to stand firm in his strength when the battle rages, to find his peace in the storm, to seek his guidance in the wilderness, to discover his joy in the obedience, to live his hope in the law. A call to trust the silent promise. God's faithfulness is not a distant echo, but a living presence, a silent promise that speaks through the flood, the desert, the mountain, a vow that binds him to us, a love that endures through every trial, a strength that upholds when all else falls, a light that shines when all else fades, a grace that flows when all else dries, a mercy that heals when all else wounds, a peace that calms when all else roars. From Noah's ark to Abraham's stars, from Moses' tablets to the journey ahead, his covenant is a thread of hope, a beacon in the darkness, a call to trust when all seems lost, to believe when faith falters, to hope when hope seems dead, to rest when the world rages, to stand when the earth trembles, to seek when the path is hidden, to find when the night is deep, to hold when the storm breaks. The Lord is faithful to all his promises and loving toward all he has made. Psalm 145:13. This is not the end, but a beginning, a foundation for the faithfulness yet to unfold, a promise that will lead us to the throne of David, to the cross of Christ, to a new covenant sealed in blood, to a future where his faithfulness reigns supreme, where his love conquers all, where his truth prevails forever, where his grace abounds eternally, where his presence fills every void, where his light dispels every shadow. What echoes in your soul as you hear this? Do you trust God's silent promise in your storms, your deserts, your mountains, or do you doubt? Seeking your own strength, turning from his faithfulness, rejecting his love, fleeing his light, grasping at the shadows of your own making, clinging to the ruins of your own will, resisting the pull of his grace. Do you see his covenant in the trials you face? Or do you stumble, blind to his rainbow, deaf to his stars, lost in the thunder of your own fears, trapped in the silence of your own despair, unable to hear his whisper, unwilling to see his hand, afraid to trust his heart? Will you anchor your life in his promise? Or will you drift, swayed by the world's noise, lost in the shadows of unbelief, adrift in the chaos of your own making, blind to the thread of his grace, deaf to the call of his love, unable to find the peace of his presence, unwilling to accept the hope of his vow? The journey continues, and his promise awaits. Will you follow where it leads? Will you trust where it calls? Will you rest in the silence of his faithful love? Will you stand in the light of his eternal vow? Will you seek his presence in the depth of your night? Will you embrace his grace in the weight of your burdens? Will you find his peace in the storm of your soul? What if the throne you dream of, the kingdom you chase, the glory you seek, the power you desire, the peace you crave, the future you long for, is but a shadow of a promise fulfilled on a rugged cross, a victory sealed in blood that outshines earthly crowns, a triumph that echoes beyond the stars, a light that pierces the void, a hope that lifts the soul, a grace that mends the broken? Can you hear the echo of a vow spoken in agony, a promise that turns death into life, A covenant that transforms your chains into freedom. If only you dare to trust it. If only you open your heart to its truth. If only you surrender to its call. If only you embrace its grace. If only you rest in its peace. If only you seek its light. Have you ever felt the weight of a judgment to come, yet found peace in a promise already kept? A faithfulness that spans eternity, calling you to rest in its truth, to stand in its light, to live in its grace, to find hope in its assurance, to anchor your spirit in its strength, to discover joy in its mercy. Why does the King of Kings, who rules the heavens and earth, who commands the angels and calms the seas, who shapes the mountains and lights the skies, who holds the winds and parts the waters, who paints the dawn and cradles the night, bind himself to a broken world with a promise of redemption, a vow that shakes the foundations of hell itself, a pledge that silences the powers of darkness, a covenant that restores the fallen, a love that redeems the lost, a grace that heals the wounded. And what if this silent promise, this eternal thread of divine love, is not just a hope for tomorrow, but a power for today, urging you to live in the freedom it offers, to stand in the light it casts, to trust in the victory it secures, to find strength in the peace it brings, to discover joy in the grace it pours, to embrace hope in the mercy it extends, to seek refuge in the love it provides. These questions rise like a dawn breaking through the night, drawing us into the sacred mystery where God's faithfulness meets human redemption, where his voice speaks through sacrifice, where his promises endure beyond the grave, where his love pierces the darkness of sin, where his presence calms the storm of judgment, where his grace shines through the shadow of death, where his truth stands firm amid the ruin, where his mercy flows through the wreckage of our lives, where his light dispels the gloom of despair, where his peace settles the chaos of our hearts, where his hope lifts the burden of our souls. They summon us to a place of wonder, where the cross bears witness to his covenants, where the empty tomb declares his truth, where the heart learns to trust the one whose word never fails, whose love never ends, whose promise never breaks, whose faithfulness never wavers, whose victory never fades, whose grace never ceases, whose light never dims, whose presence never departs, whose mercy never wanes, whose strength never falters. In a world where kingdoms fall, where thrones decay, where crowns rust, where hope fades, where peace shatters, where love wanes, where strength falters, where joy is eclipsed, where faith trembles, where courage breaks, where trust crumbles, where dreams dissolve, God's faithfulness stands as an eternal rock, a silent promise woven through the ages, calling us to hope, to believe, to rest in his unchanging heart, to find strength in his eternal love, to seek refuge in his boundless grace, to anchor our souls in his unfailing word, to discover peace in his everlasting presence, to embrace joy in his infinite mercy, to live in the victory of his promise, to walk in the light of his truth, to stand in the glory of his redemption, to thrive in the freedom of his covenant. Picture a royal hall at twilight, the air rich with the scent of cedar and burning incense, the walls adorned with tapestries that whisper of a king's lineage, a throne carved from ancient oak standing silent yet majestic, a symbol of promise yet unfulfilled, a testament to a vow in the making, a monument to a covenant unfolding, a beacon of hope in the shadows, a sanctuary of grace in the silence. The sound of harps drifts through the air, a melody of hope, mingling with the soft rustle of robes as courtiers move, their voices hushed in reverence, their steps echoing with the weight of a covenant, their hearts beating with the pulse of a promise, their souls stirred by the breath of eternity, their spirits lifted by the whisper of grace, their minds filled with the echo of a divine call. The stone floor is cool beneath your feet, grounding you in the moment, yet your heart trembles with the weight of a promise, the anticipation of a kingdom to come, the echo of a vow that spans generations, the stir of a hope that defies time, the lift of a faith that reaches heaven, the pulse of a destiny divine, the warmth of a love eternal. A distant wind carries the scent of olive groves, a reminder of the land promised, a whisper of God's faithfulness etched in the king's line, a pledge that endures beyond the throne's decay, a fragrance of grace in the royal air, a breath of eternity in the mortal realm, a hint of glory in the earthly dust, a promise woven in the breeze, a sign of hope in the twilight. The air tastes of royalty and grace, a mingling of earthly power and divine love, a blend of human triumph and heavenly mercy, a fusion of temporal glory and eternal truth, a harmony of strength and tenderness, a symphony of majesty and humility, a melody of power and peace, a sign that God's promise holds even in the rise and fall of kingdoms, a call to trust his plan beyond human strength, a covenant that outlasts the ages, a love that transcends the temporal, a peace that crowns the faithful, a joy that fills the hall. What is it like to stand in such a hall, where the throne hints at a promise, where the music stirs your soul, where trust in God's covenant becomes your crown, where the wind whispers of a future yet to unfold, where the silence holds a king's destiny, where the air breathes a divine vow, where the tapestries tell a story of grace, where the stone echoes a promise eternal, where the scent carries a hope divine, where the sound lifts your spirit, where the light fills your heart. What stirs in your heart as you hear this call? Do you trust the promise of a kingdom beyond your sight, or do you cling to the ruins of your own ambitions, doubting his faithfulness in the wait, fearing the delay, rejecting his plan, turning from his light, grasping at the shadows of your own dreams, holding to the dust of your own making, fleeing the glory of his purpose? Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. 2 Samuel 7:16. God's faithfulness is a covenant that outlasts time, a silent promise that builds a kingdom eternal, a vow that stands when all else falls, a hope that rises above the ruin, a grace that crowns the humble, a love that reigns supreme, a light that never fades. Will you rest in his vow, or will you strive, lost in the shadows of your own making, blind to the light of his reign, deaf to the song of his promise, unwilling to surrender to his will, unable to embrace his grace, resistant to the peace of his kingdom? Yeah. The covenant with David, a promise of an eternal throne. The thread of God's faithfulness stretched from the flood to the desert, and with David, it found a new chord, a covenant of a kingdom that would never end, a promise spoken to a shepherd turned king, a vow that would echo through eternity, a pledge that would shape the ages, a hope that would light the future, a love that would guide the lost, a grace that would lift the fallen. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. 2 Samuel 7:11. This was no fleeting pledge, but a divine assurance, a covenant that a descendant of David would reign forever, a silent promise that would culminate in the King of Kings, a hope that would outshine every earthly crown, a light that would pierce every shadow, a love that would conquer every foe, a grace that would redeem every soul, a peace that would calm every storm. Picture a battlefield at dawn, the air crisp with the scent of dew-kissed grass and the faint metallic tang of blood, the horizon glowing with the first light, a field where a young David felled Goliath, a testament to God's faithfulness in the face of giants, a victory born of trust, a triumph forged in faith, a hope born in courage, a light born in battle. The clash of swords fades into the distance, replaced by the soft hum of victory songs, a melody of trust, mingling with the rustle of olive leaves carried by a gentle breeze, a whisper of promise in the triumph, a chorus of hope in the dawn, a hymn of grace in the morning, a song of love in the victory, a tune of peace in the aftermath. The earth beneath your feet is soft yet firm, grounding you in the moment. Yet your heart races with the weight of a covenant, the realization of a king anointed, the hope of a throne eternal, the echo of a vow fulfilled, the stir of a destiny unfolding, the lift of a promise rising, the pulse of a faith renewed, the warmth of a hope kindled. A shepherd's staff leans against a rock, its wood worn by time, a symbol of David's humble beginnings, now crowned with the scent of royal oil. a sign of God's faithfulness lifting the lowly to glory, a mark of grace in the dust, a token of promise in the pasture, a relic of faith in the field, a witness of love in the wilderness, a beacon of hope in the struggle. The air tastes of victory and grace, a mingling of battle's end and divine favor, a blend of human courage and heavenly strength, a fusion of earthly triumph and eternal truth, a harmony of war and peace, a symphony of struggle and salvation, a melody of redemption and renewal, a reminder that God's promise raises the faithful, a call to trust his plan beyond human power, a pledge that endures through war and peace, a hope that shines through conflict, a love that crowns the humble, a peace that settles the soul, a joy that lifts the heart. What is it like to stand on such a field, where a shepherd's faith becomes a king's crown, where trust in God's promise is your strength, where the battle's end reveals his eternal vow, where the song lifts your spirit to his throne, where the staff speaks of his grace, where the dawn promises his glory, where the earth bears his victory, where the wind carries his peace, where the blood stains his love, where the light guides your path, where the air breathes his hope. Do you trust God's promise in your battles when giants rise, when strength fails, when fear looms large, when the enemy taunts loud, when the odds stack against you, when the night deepens your doubt, when the weight crushes your spirit? Do you lean on his covenant, or do you falter, doubting his faithfulness, fearing the fight, rejecting his power, turning from his shield, fleeing his light, grasping at your own weakness? The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. 1 Samuel 17:37. God's faithfulness is a shield in the struggle, a promise that upholds the faithful, a strength that overcomes the giant, a light that dispels the darkness, a grace that lifts the fallen, a love that conquers the foe, a peace that calms the battle, a hope that wins the war, a joy that crowns the victory. Will you stand in his strength, or will you flee, lost in the shadow of your fear, blind to the victory of his hand, deaf to the song of his deliverance, unable to feel the power of his promise, unwilling to trust the might of his grace, resistant to the light of his triumph? David's story reveals a God whose faithfulness anoints the humble, a covenant that turns a shepherd's staff into a scepter, a promise that builds a house eternal, a love that lifts the lowly, a grace that crowns the faithful, a mercy that restores the broken, a light that guides the lost, a strength that upholds the weak, a hope that inspires the weary. Yet his reign was tested. Consider his sin with Bathsheba, 2 Samuel 11, his failure a shadow on his throne, his heart a battlefield of guilt, his spirit a valley of shame, his soul a pit of despair, his mind a storm of regret. Yet God's faithfulness restored him through repentance, Psalm 51:10, a sign that his promise holds even in brokenness, a love that redeems the fallen, a grace that lifts the repentant, a mercy that heals the wound, a light that shines in the darkness, a peace that restores the heart, a hope that renews the spirit. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it endures in failure, that his faithfulness restores in repentance, that his love heals in confession, that his grace shines in humility, that his light pierces the darkness of sin, that his peace returns in surrender, that his hand lifts in restoration, that his hope renews in forgiveness, that his joy blossoms in renewal. Are there sins in your life where you've sought his mercy, where you've felt his restoration, where you've seen his hand lift you from the fall, where you've tasted his grace in the ashes, where you've found his love in the brokenness, where you've known his peace in the confession, where you've experienced his joy in the renewal, where you've felt his light in the healer? Consider Abigail, who interceded for David, 1 Samuel 25:32. Her wisdom, a sign of God's faithfulness. Her courage, a thread in the covenant. Her peace, a light in conflict. Her heart, a vessel of grace. Her spirit, a bridge of hope. A reminder that his promise flows through the peacemakers. A love that calms the storm. A grace that bridges the divide. A mercy that heals the rift. A light that shines in the darkness. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it works through peace, that his faithfulness shines in wisdom, that his love heals in reconciliation, that his grace flows in harmony, that his light glows in unity, that his peace prevails in understanding, that his hope restores in forgiveness. Are there conflicts in your life where you've sought peace, where you've trusted his wisdom, where you've seen his hand in reconciliation, where you've felt his love in the calm, where you've known his grace in the harmony, where you've tasted his mercy in the resolution, where you've found his light in the unity? Consider Ruth, who clung to Naomi, Ruth 1:16, her loyalty a sign of God's faithfulness, her journey a thread in the covenant, her faith a witness to his promise, her heart a vessel of trust, her spirit a flame of devotion, a reminder that his faithfulness guides the faithful, a love that binds the broken, a grace that leads the wanderer, a hope that finds a home, a peace that settles the exile. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it guides the loyal, that his faithfulness supports the steadfast, that his love binds the lost, that his grace leads the seeking, that his light shines on the path, that his peace settles the heart, that his joy crowns the faithful, that his hope lights the way. Are there journeys in your life where you've been loyal, where you've trusted his guidance, where you've felt his love in the binding, where you've seen his grace in the leading, where you've found his peace in the homecoming, where you've known his joy in the refuge, where you've tasted his hope in the journey? Consider Samuel, who heard God's voice first. Samuel 3:10, his obedience a sign of God's faithfulness, his calling a thread in the covenant, his life a witness to his promise, his heart a temple of trust, his spirit a light of devotion, a reminder that his faithfulness speaks in the quiet, a love that calls in the night, a grace that anoints the young, a hope that guides the chosen, a peace that fills the silence. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it speaks in silence, that his faithfulness calls in the dark, that his love anoints the humble, that his grace guides the obedient, that his light shines in the whisper, that his peace settles the night, that his voice awakens the soul. Are there moments you've heard his call, where you've trusted his voice, where you've felt his love in the anointing, where you've seen his grace in the guidance, where you've known his hope in the quiet, where you've experienced his peace in the stillness, where you've found his light in the dawn? Consider Esther, who risked her life, Esther chapter 14. Her courage a sign of God's faithfulness, her faith a thread in the covenant, her spirit a witness to his promise, a reminder that his faithfulness delivers in danger, a love that empowers the brave, a grace that crowns the risk, a hope that saves the nation, a peace that steadies the heart. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it delivers in danger, that his faithfulness empowers the brave, that his love crowns the risk, that his grace saves the nation, that his light shines in the crisis, that his peace steadies the soul, that his joy rewards the faithful. Are there risks in your life where you've been brave, where you've trusted his deliverance, where you've felt his love in the danger, where you've seen his grace in the rescue, where you've known his hope in the trial, where you've tasted his peace in the victory? Consider Daniel, who faced the lions, Daniel 6:22, his faith a sign of God's faithfulness, his trust a thread in the covenant, his life a witness to his promise, a reminder that his faithfulness protects in peril, a love that shuts the lions' mouths, a grace that delivers the faithful, a hope that calms the den, a peace that reigns in the fire. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it protects in peril, that his faithfulness shuts the lions' mouths, that his love delivers the faithful, that his grace calms the den, that his light shines in the darkness, that his peace reigns in the trial, that he avoid triumphs in the rescue. Are there perils in your life where you've trusted his protection, where you've felt his love in the danger, where you've seen his grace in the deliverance, where you've known his hope in the den, where you've experienced his peace in the fire, where you've found his light in the shadow? This is the fourth thread, a call to trust his promise in victory and failure, to see his faithfulness in the crown and the cross, to rest in his covenant when the battle rages, to find his light in the shadow of sin, to seek his grace in the restoration, to discover his peace in the repentance, to embrace his love in the correction, to stand in his strength in the trial, to walk in his light in the darkness, to live in his hope in the struggle, to thrive in his joy in the triumph. Reshaped, the new covenant, a promise sealed in blood. From David's throne came a greater king, and with Jesus, God's faithfulness reached its zenith. A covenant sealed not in stone but in blood, a promise written on hearts, a vow that shattered the power of sin and death, a pledge that opened the way to eternity, a love that poured out to redeem, a grace that transformed the broken into the beloved, a victory that silenced the grave, a hope that lighted the path to heaven, a peace that calmed the storm of the soul. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. Hebrews 8:10. This was no temporary pact, but an eternal bond. A silent promise fulfilled on the cross. A love that flowed from a wounded side. A grace that bridged the gap between God and man. A triumph that conquered the powers of darkness. A light that pierced the night. A peace that calmed the tempest. A joy that filled the emptiness. Picture a hill at noon, the air heavy with the scent of blood and dry earth, the sky darkened as if morning. A cross rising stark against the horizon, its wood stained with sacrifice, a symbol of love beyond measure, a beacon of hope in the agony, a sign of redemption in the pain, a light in the darkness of despair, a refuge in the storm of suffering. The sound of nails piercing flesh fades into a groan of agony, mingling with the distant wail of a watching crowd, a chorus of sorrow and awe, a hymn of redemption in the pain, a song of victory in the suffering, a cry of love in the silence, a prayer of grace in the darkness, a whisper of hope in the torment, a melody of peace in the sacrifice. The ground beneath your feet trembles, warm yet unsteady, grounding you in the moment. Yet your heart quakes with the weight of a covenant, the realization of a Savior dying, the hope of a promise fulfilled, the echo of a vow sealed in blood, the stir of a new beginning, the lift of a redeemed soul, the pulse of a resurrected life, the warmth of a love divine. A tear falls from the heavens, a drop of rain on parched land, a sign of God's faithfulness washing clean, a whisper of grace amid the suffering, a pledge of life beyond the grave, a token of mercy in the darkness, a gift of hope in the desolation, a balm of love in the wound, a shower of peace in the storm, a river of joy in the pain. The air tastes of sorrow and redemption, a mingling of death and victory, a blend of sacrifice and salvation, a fusion of pain and peace, a harmony of loss and love, a symphony of suffering and triumph, a melody of grace and glory, a chorus of hope and healing, a reminder that God's promise triumphs over darkness, a call to trust his love beyond the cross, a covenant that outlasts the tomb, a grace that heals the wound, a light that dawns in the night, a hope that rises in the dawn, a peace that settles the heart. What is it like to stand on such a hill, where the cross becomes your hope, where trust in God's promise is your salvation, where the blood speaks of his faithfulness, where the silence holds his victory, where the tear washes your soul, where the trembling earth proclaims his power, where the darkened sky reveals his glory, where the air breathes his love, where the rain cleanses your heart, where the groan lifts your spirit, where the blood seal is your redemption. Do you trust God's promise in your suffering? When pain overwhelms, when death looms, when despair grips your heart, when the cross seems distant, when the night deepens your sorrow, when the burden crushes your strength, when the silence deafens your hope, do you cling to his covenant or do you despair? Doubting his faithfulness, fearing the end, rejecting his grace, turning from his light, fleeing his comfort, grasping at the shadows of your pain. It is finished. John 19:30. God's faithfulness is a victory sealed in blood, a promise that redeems the lost, a love that conquers the grave, a grace that lifts the fallen, a hope that pierces the darkness, a peace that calms the storm, a light that guides the weary, a strength that upholds the weak, a joy that fills the empty, a mercy that heals the broken. Will you rest in his grace, or will you struggle, lost in the shadow of your pain, blind to the light of his triumph, deaf to the song of his victory, unable to feel the warmth of his embrace, unwilling to accept the joy of his salvation, resistant to the peace of his promise, deaf to the call of his love, blind to the hope of his cross? Jesus' sacrifice reveals a God whose faithfulness redeems fully, a covenant that turns the cross into a throne, a promise that transforms death into life, a love that bridges the divide, a grace that restores the broken, a mercy that heals the wounded, a victory that shatters the chains, a hope that lights the path, a peace that settles the soul, a joy that crowns the faithful. Consider Mary Magdalene, who wept at the tomb, John 20:18. Her sorrow turned to joy, her life a testament to God's faithfulness, a sign that his promise reaches the broken, a grace that turns tears into testimony, a love that lifts the weary, a light that dawns in the morning, a hope that rises from the grave, a peace that fills the empty heart, a joy that blooms in the resurrection. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it comforts the weeping, that his faithfulness heals the wounded, that his love restores the lost, that his grace shines in the resurrection, that his light dawns in the morning, that his peace settles in the dawn, that his joy blooms in the tears, that his hope lifts in the silence, that his mercy flows in the dawn. Are there sorrows in your life where you've found his comfort, where you've felt his healing, where you've seen his hand lift you from despair, where you've tasted his grace in the dawn, where you've known his love in the silence, where you've felt his hope in the resurrection, where you've experienced his peace in the light, where you've rejoiced in his joy in the morning? Consider Stephen, stoned yet praying, Acts 7:59. His death a sign of God's faithfulness, his faith a thread in the covenant, his spirit a witness to his promise, a reminder that his love endures in martyrdom, a grace that triumphs in sacrifice, a light that shines in the fire, a hope that prevails in the end, a peace that reigns in the suffering, a joy that crowns the faithful, a strength that upholds the martyr. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it holds in death, that his faithfulness shines in suffering, that his love prevails in persecution, that his grace crowns the faithful, that his light guides the departing, that his peace sustains the martyr, that his victory echoes beyond the grave, that his mercy comforts the persecuted, that his word lifts the spirit, that his hope endures the flames. Are there trials in your life where you've stood firm, where you've trusted his promise, where you've felt his love in the fire, where you've seen his grace in the end, where you've found his strength in the stones, where you've tasted his hope in the sacrifice, where you've known his peace in the struggle, where you've experienced his joy in the victory? Consider John, who walked with Jesus, firm, John 1:7. His life a sign of God's faithfulness, his words a thread in the covenant, his love a witness to his promise, a reminder that his faithfulness cleanses through fellowship, a love that unites in truth, a grace that purifies the soul, a light that shines in the community, a hope that binds the faithful, a peace that flows in the gathering, a joy that thrives in the bond. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it cleanses through community, that his faithfulness flows in unity, that his love binds in purity, that his grace shines in fellowship, that his light glows in the gathering, that his peace reigns in the bond, that his joy flourishes in the love, that his hope strengthens the church, that his mercy unites the broken. Are there times you found strength in community, where you've trusted his promise, where you've felt his love in unity, where you've seen his grace in the church, where you've known his light in the bond, where you've tasted his hope in the fellowship, where you've experienced his peace in the gathering, where you've rejoiced in his joy in the communion? Consider Thomas, who doubted yet believed, John 20:29. His journey a sign of God's faithfulness, his faith a thread in the covenant, his trust a witness to his promise, a reminder that his faithfulness meets our doubt, a love that answers our questions, a grace that blesses our belief, a light that dispels our uncertainty, a hope that strengthens our faith, a peace that calms our fears, a joy that fills our hearts. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it embraces our doubts, that his faithfulness meets our questions, that his love answers our fears, that his grace blesses our faith, that his light shines in our uncertainty, that his peace settles our hearts, that his joy fills our belief, that his hope lifts our spirits, that his mercy heals our doubts. Are there moments of doubt in your life where you've sought his truth, where you've felt his hand, where you've seen his love, where you've found his grace in belief, where you've tasted his peace and faith, where you've known his hope and trust, where you've experienced his light in surrender, where you've rejoiced in his joy and conviction? Consider Peter, freed from prison by an angel, Acts 12:7. His deliverance a sign of God's faithfulness, his escape a thread in the covenant, his faith a witness to his promise, a reminder that his faithfulness breaks the chains, a love that opens the doors, a grace that sets the captive free, a light that guides the prisoner, a hope that lifts the bound, a peace that fills the cell, a joy that crowns the release. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it breaks the bonds, that his faithfulness delivers the captive, that his love opens the way, that his grace frees the bound, that his light shines in the prison, that his peace reigns in the escape, that his joy blooms in the liberty, that his hope lifts the spirit, that his mercy unlocks the chains. Are there chains in your life where you've sought freedom, where you've trusted his deliverance, where you've felt his love in the opening, where you've seen his grace in the release, where you've known his hope in the liberty, where you've experienced his peace in the escape, where you've tasted his joy in the freedom, where you've found his light in the breaking? Consider Esther, who risked her life. Deuteronomy 14, her courage a sign of God's faithfulness, her faith a thread in the covenant, her spirit a witness to his promise, a reminder that his faithfulness delivers in danger, a love that empowers the brave, a grace that crowns the risk, a hope that saves the nation, a peace that steadies the heart, a joy that rewards the sacrifice, a light that guides the bold. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it delivers in danger, that his faithfulness empowers the brave, that his love crowns the risk, that his grace saves the nation, that his light shines in the crisis, that his peace steadies the soul, that his joy rewards the faithful, that his hope lifts the spirit, that his mercy prevails in the peril. Are there risks in your life where you've been brave, where you've trusted his deliverance, where you've felt his love in the danger, where you've seen his grace in the rescue, where you've known his hope in the trial, where you've tasted his peace in the victory, where you've experienced his joy in the courage, where you've found his light in the sacrifice? Consider Daniel, who faced the lions, Daniel 6:22. His faith a sign of God's faithfulness, his trust a thread in the covenant, his life a witness to his promise, a reminder that his faithfulness protects in peril, a love that shuts the lions' mouths, a grace that delivers the faithful, a hope that calms the den, a peace that reigns in the fire, a joy that triumphs in the rescue, a light that shines in the darkness. What does this reveal about trusting his promise? That it protects in peril, that his faithfulness shuts the lions' mouths, that his love delivers the faithful, that his grace calms the den, that his light shines in the darkness, that his peace reigns in the trial, that his joy triumphs in the rescue, that his hope sustains the heart, that his mercy guards the soul. Are there perils in your life where you've trusted his protection, where you've felt his love in the danger, where you've seen his grace in the deliverance, where you've known his hope in the den, where you've experienced his peace in the fire, where you've found his light in the shadow, where you've tasted his joy in the safety? Consider Lydia, who opened her heart, Acts 14, her faith a sign of God's faithfulness, her hospitality a thread in the covenant, her life a witness to his promise, a reminder that his faithfulness opens the heart, a love that welcomes the gospel, a grace that transforms the seeker, a hope that fills the home, a peace that reigns in the opening, a joy that blooms in the faith. What does this teach you about trusting his covenant? That it opens the heart, that his faithfulness transforms the seeker, that his love welcomes the gospel, that his grace fills the home, that his light shines in the opening, that his peace reigns in the faith, that his joy blooms in the trust, that his hope guides the journey. Are there moments you've opened your heart, where you've trusted his transformation, where you've felt his love in the welcome, where you've seen his grace in the filling, where you've known his peace in the faith, where you've experienced his joy in the trust, where you've found his hope in the journey? This is the fifth thread, a call to trust his promise in redemption, to see his faithfulness in the cross, to rest in his covenant when death threatens, to find his light in the darkness of sin, to seek his grace in the victory of Christ, to discover his peace in the resurrection, to embrace his love in the sacrifice, to experience his joy in the fellowship, to know his hope in the belief, to feel his strength in the deliverance, to live his freedom in the chains, to taste his mercy in the peril, to walk his peace in the trial. Reshaped. Living in the promise, freedom, and judgment. God's faithfulness calls us to live in the freedom of his covenant, to stand in the victory of the cross, to prepare for the judgment to come with confidence in his promise, to walk in the light of his grace, to rest in the shadow of his mercy, to thrive in the strength of his love, to rejoice in the joy of his salvation, to anchor our souls in the hope of his eternity. There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Romans 8:1. This is a life unshackled, a hope unshakable, a call to trust his grace today and his justice tomorrow, a promise that frees the soul, a covenant that secures the heart, a love that lifts the spirit, a truth that guides the path, a light that leads the way, a peace that fills the journey, a joy that crowns the walk. Picture a valley at dusk, the air soft with the scent of wildflowers and flowing water, the sky a tapestry of fading light, a place where the soul reflects on eternity, a ground where the promise meets the future, a landscape where hope and judgment intertwine, a realm where grace and truth converge, a haven where peace and justice meet, a sanctuary where loving and mercy dwell. The sound of a gentle stream mingles with the rustle of leaves, a melody of peace, a whisper of hope, a song of judgment and mercy intertwined, a harmony of grace and truth, a symphony of redemption and renewal, a chorus of love and justice, a hymn of light and life, a tune of faith and assurance, a rhythm of joy and redemption. The earth beneath your feet is cool and firm, grounding you in the moment, yet your heart lifts with the weight of a promise, the anticipation of a judgment day, the assurance of a Savior's grace, the echo of a covenant fulfilled, the stir of a future secured, the pulse of a hope eternal, the lift of a spirit redeemed, the warmth of a love divine. A distant star glows, a sign of God's faithfulness guiding you home, a pledge of life beyond the valley, a light that leads through the shadow of death, a beacon that pierces the night, a hope that shines in the dawn, a promise that lights the path, a star that marks the way, a guide that never fades, a light that never wanes, a hope that never does. The air tastes of hope and redemption, a mingling of earth and eternity, a blend of trial and triumph, a fusion of sorrow and joy, a harmony of loss and love, a symphony of suffering and victory, a melody of peace and promise, a chorus of grace and glory, a hymn of faith and freedom, a reminder that God's promise secures your future, a call to trust his love in the face of judgment, a covenant that holds forever, a grace that endures eternally, a love that conquers all, a peace that reigns supreme, a joy that fills the valley. What is it like to stand in such a valley, where the promise becomes your peace, where trust in God's covenant is your hope, where the star guides your soul, where the stream washes your fears, where the light leads to eternity, where the earth holds your faith, where the air breathes his love, where the water reflects his mercy, where the sky proclaims his truth, where the sound sings his grace, where the star lights your path, where the stream calms your heart. Do you live in his promise when judgment looms, when freedom calls, when the end draws near, when the future casts its shadow, when the night deepens your doubt, when the burden weighs your spirit, when the silence deafens your hope? Do you rest in his grace, or do you fear, doubting his faithfulness, clinging to your works, rejecting his peace, turning from his light, grasping at the ruins of your own righteousness, fleeing the shelter of his love, resisting the strength of his hand? Thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 15:57. God's faithfulness is your triumph, a promise that secures your soul, a grace that crowns your faith, a love that guarantees your hope, a light that dispels your fear, a strength that upholds your spirit, a peace that calms your heart, a joy that lifts your soul, a mercy that fills your life, a truth that guides your steps. Will you walk in his victory, or will you stumble, lost in the shadow of your doubt, blind to the light of his promise, deaf to the song of his grace, unable to feel the warmth of his embrace, unwilling to accept the joy of his salvation, resistant to the peace of his promise, deaf to the call of his love, blind to the hope of his cross, unable to find the strength of his hand? This life of faith calls us to freedom. Let go of guilt, stand in grace, share his love, and prepare for his reward. Consider your walk. Are you living in the promise, trusting his faithfulness, resting in his victory, embracing his peace, walking in his light, thriving in his joy, anchoring your soul in his hope? Or are you still bound by what he has freed, chained by what he has broken, lost in what he has redeemed, trapped by what he has conquered, weighed down by what he has lifted, blind to what he has opened? The journey ends in his presence. Will you trust the silent promise that leads you there? Will you follow the light that guides you home? Will you rest in the love that holds you forever? Will you stand in the grace that lifts you eternally? Will you rejoice in the victory that crowns you forever? Will you find peace in the hope that secures your soul? Will you live in the joy that fills your heart? Will you walk in the truth that lights your path?